They arrived as the so-called secret army that would finally save Putin, but in the very first firefight, they killed their own Russian allies. What seemed impossible happened in a trench outside Kursk. Total confusion, mistranslated orders, and a North Korean platoon massacring 8 Chechen soldiers from the Akhmat battalion. And the most shocking part is that this force was announced in the fall of 2024 as the reinforcement that would change the course of the war. Today, experts say it has become the Kremlin's biggest backfire. In this video, you are going to understand why. What happened in that trench was not an isolated accident. It was born from a scenario that had already been a nightmare in the making. And it all begins when the intelligence agencies of the United States, the United Kingdom, and South Korea identified something that should not exist in the 21st century: entire rail convoys transporting North Korean troops to Western Russia. Satellites captured regular formations, marching patterns typical of the DPRK, and reports pointed to at least 10,000 soldiers on the move. In Washington, the assessment was immediate. If Pyongyang was sending military contingents into an active war, it meant Kim Jong-un had officially stepped onto the European chessboard. The fear was not an exaggeration. Analysts at the Pentagon projected a scenario where that number could rise to 50,000 or even 100,000 men, something that could indeed shift saturated and exhausted front lines. But on the Russian side, the panic was different. In August of 2024, Ukraine had done the unthinkable, a surprise incursion that broke through the Kursk border and captured approximately 500 square miles of territory. A symbolic and military defeat the Kremlin did not expect and did not want to explain to the public. Moscow needed to replace manpower quickly. But another mobilization would be political suicide. The previous call-ups had already triggered protests, desertions, and a mass exodus to Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Finland. The solution they landed on was as risky as it was humiliating: importing soldiers. The North Koreans arrived under the promise of being a disciplined force, hardened by extreme training, obedient to any order. Their mission was clear and direct: retake the territory lost in Kursk and regain control of the region at any cost. There was only one problem. All of this depended on the premise that this force would actually function as a real combat unit. And it is exactly in this unstable context that the episode emerged, the one that became a bitter joke in military circles. The Chechen elite, the feared Kadyrovites, being wiped out by North Korean allies. To understand the impact, you need to know who the victims were. The Akhmat battalion, commanded by Ramzan Kadyrov, is not a regular unit. They are known for their brutality, their absolute obedience, and for a role no soldier wants to admit officially. They act as barrier troops, tasked with preventing retreats, including shooting Russians who try to flee. Their presence in Kursk was not symbolic. They were the unit sent to control weaker allies and enforce discipline in the sector. But on December 14th, that machinery jammed in a shocking way. According to reports intercepted by Ukrainian intelligence, the night was tense. The Chechens were patrolling a newly fortified section when they saw, in the distance, a column of vehicles that was supposed to be North Korean, returning from digging duties and ammunition transport. Radio communications, already chaotic, got even worse. There was only one interpreter for every 30 North Koreans, and none of them were with that particular convoy. In other words, there was no way to confirm identity, intent, or the day's password. The Chechens followed standard protocol: headlights, signal flashes, and short calls. The North Koreans understood absolutely nothing. Tension spiked instantly. When a Russian truck moved slightly past the expected point, the North Koreans panicked, thinking they were being ambushed. They did what they are trained to do in North Korea: shoot first and ask later. The result was a massacre that lasted seconds. Bursts cut across the road, glass shattered, and 2 Akhmat vehicles turned into sitting targets. The final report: 8 Chechens killed, 3 wounded, and 1 Russian Humvee destroyed. And that is when the cruelest irony of this war appeared. The most feared soldiers in the Russian Federation were taken out not by Ukrainian forces, but by the very allies who were supposed to save the front. The clash between Chechens and North Koreans was not an isolated accident. It was the direct consequence of an alliance built on top of a military Tower of Babel. Starting with the obvious: 1 interpreter for every 30 soldiers. On an active front, that is a death sentence. Essential commands like stop, advance, fire, or fall back need to be instantaneous. But in Kursk, every order had to pass through a human mediator who was not always in the same spot on the line, not always hearing the correct instruction, and often simply not present at all. When a group depends on translation to survive, nobody survives properly. Ukrainian interceptions revealed this with brutal clarity. In audio recordings shared among analysts, Russian soldiers sounded frustrated and lost, calling the North Koreans the Chinese, a racist nickname used out of both ignorance and exasperation. Amid the noise of explosions, you could hear short phrases cut by panic. "They are not responding. Tell them to stop. Tell them to stop. Who is the interpreter for this mess?" These recordings made it clear that the officers on the ground had completely lost control of the situation. They simply did not know how to command their new allies. But the problem went far beyond language. These were two incompatible military cultures trying to operate as if they were a single force. The North Koreans were trained to obey without question, march in rigid blocks, execute repetitive movements, and depend on direct supervision. It is a doctrine of conditioning, not adaptation. Meanwhile, modern Russian doctrine, at least on paper, requires rapid reaction, dynamic communication, coordination with drones and artillery, and use of tactical radios. It is the opposite of the North Korean model, and to make matters worse, their equipment was not even compatible. Many Koreans arrived with analog radios and mismatched frequencies, completely unable to integrate with the Russian Strelets system. That meant half the patrol never received attack alerts, changes of plan, or retreat orders. When the battlefield starts shifting and you do not understand anything happening around you, the natural instinct is to shoot at anything that moves. The truth is that Moscow tried to merge two forces that should never have shared the same trench: Russian soldiers accustomed to improvisation and North Korean soldiers incapable of interpreting improvisation. The biggest lie in this entire story is the word elite. Moscow sold to the public and to itself the idea that it was receiving the feared Storm Corps, an alleged North Korean unit trained for special operations, hardened by pain rituals and ideological conditioning. In propaganda videos, they appear breaking bricks with their heads, plunging into ice, shouting patriotic slogans in unison, and performing choreographed hand-to-hand combat demonstrations. To someone who does not understand modern warfare, it looks impressive. To any serious analyst, it looks like theater. But the physical reality of these soldiers is the opposite of the myth. North Korea has suffered from chronic malnutrition for decades. This is not an opinion, it is a statistic. The regime itself admits that the average calorie intake per adult is considerably lower than any Western or Russian military standard. The result is recruits who are smaller, lighter, with less muscular endurance and lower tolerance to prolonged stress. The body may withstand extreme rituals for a few minutes, but it cannot sustain weeks of open field operations against drones, artillery, and sub-zero temperatures. Training to resist pain does not help when you need to run with body armor, ammunition, and a radio, while an FPV drone dives toward you at 150 km per hour. Their combat history also crushes the myth. North Korea's last real war was in the 1950s, 70 years ago. Later engagements, such as in Vietnam or occasional missions in the Middle East, were symbolic, small, and strategically irrelevant. This means the North Korean military institution has not accumulated experience in modern warfare. It does not understand sensor-driven combat, drone saturation, or coordination with precision artillery. In short, beating straw dummies during parades in Pyongyang does not prepare anyone to survive a European battlefield in 2024. And here is the revelation Russia tried hardest to hide. Most of the soldiers sent to Kursk were not even Storm Corps. They were regular recruits, many between 17 and 20 years old, along with military engineers used as labor for fortifications. Moscow inflated the narrative to justify using these troops as reinforcements, when in reality it was receiving inexperienced, fragile young men with only basic training, nothing remotely close to special forces. When the North Koreans arrived at the front, Russia tried to forcibly turn them into modern soldiers, equipping those undernourished young men with FPV drones, digital radios, and night vision goggles they barely knew how to power on. Many had never seen a computer, a tablet, or even a real smartphone. Training at bases in eastern Russia was rushed and superficial. Just a few days of improvised courses, repeating memorized commands with no real practice and no understanding of why the maneuvers mattered. It was like putting someone who had never driven behind the wheel of a Formula One car and telling them to race. The result was predictable. mistakes, panic, loss of control, and deaths. Faced with this inability to adapt, Russia resorted to the most brutal and oldest tactic in its doctrine, turning these foreign soldiers into disposable cannon fodder. The process worked like this. Before attacking a Ukrainian position, commanders sent North Korean groups to advance in line across open ground. They served two purposes. First, to absorb enemy fire. Second, to reveal the locations of machine guns, drone nests, and ATGM operators. Every death became a marker on the map for Russian artillery. It was a method as cruel as it was efficient. For those applying it, for those on the line, it was nothing but a massacre. And here comes the most disturbing detail, revealed by internal reports from the Russian army itself. To hide the real number of casualties and prevent Pyongyang from demanding explanations, many North Korean bodies were burned, buried without documentation, or disfigured before transport. The order was simple: ensure nothing could be identified, no face recognized, no number returned. What mattered was not preserving the dignity of the dead, but maintaining the illusion that the foreign force was being useful. In essence, it was better to erase evidence than admit that dozens of them were dying in every operation. This practice created an atmosphere of quiet horror inside the Russian ranks themselves. Soldiers who witnessed these actions described the front as a place where North Korean life had less value than an FPV drone. In just 3 days in the Kursk sector, the numbers revealed the scale of the disaster. More than 50 North Korean soldiers killed, dozens wounded, and many others missing, some reduced to fragments after drone strikes. It was a rate of losses that would be unsustainable for any experienced unit, let alone for unprepared recruits thrown into a war they did not understand. For the front line, their presence became a clear sign that Moscow was improvising with human lives. For the Ukrainians, it was simply further confirmation that Russia had lost the ability to replenish its forces without relying on desperate alliances. And when we look at the situation from the perspective of the two leaders involved, the picture becomes even darker. For Putin, these soldiers are replaceable. They buy time, occupy space, absorb enemy fire, and allow the Russian army to breathe while it reorganizes its units. It is the logic of the Soviet machine of 1943, applied in 2024. For Kim Jong-un, the calculation is even colder. Sending troops to die on the Russian front means receiving in return nuclear technology, ballistic missile components, satellite imagery, food and fuel. Young lives are the bargaining chips of a regime that prioritizes intercontinental rockets over its own population. The military lesson left by this episode is brutal but clear. Numbers do not win modern wars. Without integrated communication, without compatible equipment, without a unified doctrine, without stable chains of command, any army, whether Russian, North Korean, or from any other country, becomes nothing more than a disorganized mass walking toward slaughter. The so-called Axis of Evil alliance, feared by analysts months ago, is proving fragile, uncoordinated, and incompetent in the face of the technical demands of contemporary warfare. And now I want to know your opinion. Do you think this alliance will last, or will these errors force North Korea to pull back? Leave your thoughts here in the comments. Now, before we wrap up, there is one detail that makes everything even stranger. This partnership did not just fail in Kursk, it also started turning against the Russians themselves on another front. If you want to understand how Kim's gift became a new nightmare for Moscow, click on the video appearing on your screen. It will show you exactly what happened. See you there.